Thank you all for joining us. We are so excited to feature our next Fireside Chat with Trevor McFedries and Arya Dean. They are going to talk about the future of storytelling, art, and AI. Trevor is the founder of the tech startup called Brud. He is the creator of a virtual pop star, Michaela, or Lil Michaela, a Gen Z teen with millions of fans around the world. Aria is an artist and a writer based in New York and Los Angeles. She is currently editor and curator at Rhizome. All right, Trevor, Aria, take it away.
Hey, I'm Trevor McFedries. I'm the founder and CEO of Brud. Also do some fun little art stuff on the side and made some music in a past life. I think we're going to be talking a bit about Lil Michaela, the characters in our universe, and probably a good time to give you some context. So here's a sizzle, little video context, one of these ways.
You never say how you really feel. How can I know if this thing is real? Is it all in my head? Am I making it up? Am I thinking too much? Why can't I just say it? Cause even if it's just in my mind, my heart is still hurting, so I know
I can heavily relate to anyone who's ever felt out of place.
Because you're a robot.
What's up? It's Michaela here with YouTube Music at Coachella, and I'm joined by J Balvin.
What is your dream for the future?
For everyone to experience healing and safety.
Mick, tell everyone to go to the Brud YouTube and listen to your new song.
Go to the Brud YouTube and listen to my new song. I made a brand new song just for my Michaelians, and I'm so excited to share it. And as always, don't forget to recharge your heart. Peace.
I'm Arya Dean. I'm an artist and writer, and I'm editor and curator at Rhizome, organization founded in 1996, based at the New Museum that focuses on net art and digital culture. So yeah, we're going to talk about those things and yeah, Michaela and other surrounding concepts. Okay, so let me reopen this Google Doc.
Thanks for hanging out with me, Aria. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Anytime. My pleasure. Okay. And I think this is like a continuation, of course, of past conversations that we've had, like, you know, in a way, but we'll try to not get too far ahead of ourselves, I think. So, okay. I mean, I guess initially the first thing, you know, to talk about is Lil Michaela at large.
Sure.
So I guess, like, if you want to walk us through why and how and when and all that stuff about, yeah,
I mean, it could probably be pretty long-winded, but I'll try to keep it like mostly concise. I think that the company Brud and Michaela, the character, and for those at home who aren't familiar, I kind of think of the parent company almost like a Disney, and then Michaela almost like the Mickey or something in our universe, Mickey Mouse, that is. And it probably is a manifestation of like my lived experience and this idea of me being this kind of like software engineer kid who was poking around building stuff in Iowa, and then moved to LA and, went from this kind of like smaller town to a place where everyone was chasing their entrepreneurial or kind of like creative dreams and recognized you could do that. And, ended up getting like a football scholarship out of high school and came back to LA and had this music opportunity where I was in a band that ended up putting out a top 10 record and got to kind of see the machinations of like the big media machine. And from that joined Spotify and got to see how like the lean startup works and kind of like modern software development and talking to customers and shipping products. And, you know, in between those things was producing artists and working with pop acts. And while at Spotify, I was managing and producing an artist named Banks. And, you know, around 2015 or so, I was really spending a lot of time in kind of the traditional hacker chats that I lived in, whether it was on IRC or, you know, similar spaces, and was encountering kind of like a newer ideology to me. Traditionally, those spaces have kind of been, you know, pumped full of Kevin Kelly style Wired magazine techno optimism. We were all going to save the world with the internet. And it had since kind of devolved into kind of like, I guess like a more corrosive and regressive ideology from my point of view. And in parallel was discovering the television program Will and Grace far too late, and all this data around Will and Grace being largely responsible for the gay marriage push and eventual accomplishment in the United States. And got into some other information and data around the Jeffersons and civil rights, and, you know, kind of recognized that media could be this really powerful tool for creating social change, and started thinking, like, wouldn't it be cool if you could kind of do that narrative thing at the scale of a Facebook where you're touching billions in parallel? And that kind of presented this question, why hadn't it happened? And it started to become clear that traditional talent didn't scale well. You know, Jennifer Lawrence couldn't speak Mandarin or Portuguese or whatever it was. And was there an opportunity to create a Rihanna or Katy Perry that could be everything to all people, or kind of like touch people globally and introduce themes that are important via these narratives that were as engaging or as compelling as a Kardashian or a Trump or whoever was dominating our kind of like, you know, our media diets or feeds at the moment? And that's kind of like the seedlings that birthed into all of this.
Okay, sorry, I'm like muting myself because all these like construction sounds outside the window. It's interesting. Well, okay, I have questions that sort of are sideways from that, but also before that, I'll say, so what has been surprising since, or like, you know, how has your understanding of the project evolved as it's, you know, actually, you know, she's taken on this life online? And yeah, like what, like, you know, update us, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, for this audience, there are so many things every day. I think the thing that I usually echo is I often get lost in the technology piece. Like, it was clear even at the time, like there was a real big hype around VR when I started this thing, about headsets and gaming. I always felt that like the emergent metaverse, or kind of like spatial computing future, would be kind of less Ready Player One, you know, kind of like virtual, all immersive kind of virtual experience, like more this digital layer on top of our lives. And I actually think, you know, instead of being kind of like world driven, I think it would be like more character driven. And, you know, we'll see that comes to pass, but tides have shifted that way. And in that moment, there was a lot of investment into the kind of emergent AR and VR space. Some of it, you know, went away. A lot of VR shops closed. Obviously, you know, stuff like Magic Leap has struggled. But the technological changes have been interesting, and I think I sometimes romanticize like the like, you know, the way things evolve there. But ultimately, it always comes back to the story, the character, the kind of the core narrative stuff. I think that's been like a lesson learned over and over again. But for this audience, I've been really intrigued at how, you know, our characters, especially Michaela, have moved through popular culture. Kind of like immediately starting in kind of a, you know, maybe an older subset that kind of found it transgressive. I mean, we were on Instagram, and they kind of, I think, understood this was kind of a tongue-in-cheek way to explore a lot of like topical themes, and then kind of moved down quite a bit into like young YouTuber land, where there was like conspiracies and kind of like Shane Dawson YouTube commentary, and then kind of moved up the stack a bit where it became a bit more mainstream, and I feel like it was kind of like high school age conversation, and then went like way up the stack where I feel like those kids were talking to their parents, and there we had like, you know, Tracy Ellis Rosses of the world reaching out and like wanting to hang out with Michaela. And so there is some kind of like cool anthropological thing to go back and probably look at the different cohorts and like demos of people that got into this thing along the way.
Right, you can kind of like map how culture moves in general from like, just like, it's like tagging something kind of and being like, okay, like now we're going to see how that's really interesting. I also was going to say, oh, what was the YouTuber like, or was the conspiracy stuff around it? Like that. Like,
oh man, like you and I could probably talk about this stuff for like years, but I think it was, so there's a YouTuber named Shane Dawson who probably is like my age. I'm 34. I mean, he's been in like YouTube since the beginning, like full emo side bang YouTube. So, like, you know, sans serif or like slight serif DTC product era, whatever we're living in now. But he kind of had these series of videos where he would explore like conspiracy theory light stuff on his YouTube channel, where it would be like, you know, our Harry and Niall from One Direction secretly involved and have a baby together. you know, where you just be like, what? But there was probably some like fan fiction thing that like bled into like the Tumblr or Twitter sphere, and he would kind of riff on it. And with Michaela, there had been a Twitter thread where I think, you know, probably some young kid was like, what is this girl? Is she real? Is she a government conspiracy to like make us want to like buy into AI and robots? And he kind of took it a couple steps further where he was like, is this like a Sims 5, like the game, The Sims 5, like marketing ploy? Is this X? Yeah. And so it took on all of these lives. People started kind of, I guess, prescribing these narratives onto it. It like, the project in that moment was like, I don't know, like Shepherd Fairy, Obey Giant, like digital version where like you stuck Michaela's head enough places, people just started like giving it meaning.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that was like definitely a bizarre one, but those videos are still up, and we ended up doing some stuff with Shane and, you know, talking to him about the experience.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah. Like the sort of like, I mean, it's kind of, I guess, just sort of spinning out into like the larger, you know, ecosystem that Michaela exists in, thinking about that, but like, the sort of ways in which it also models like this sort of, you know, like reality versus projection kind of like complex of like how people are receiving information online, which is like the sort of the obvious like centerpiece of a lot of conspiracy stuff, but like, but also just part of our day-to-day experiences. So it's like, okay, there's the actuality of, you know, what she is, which is that, you know, she doesn't exist necessarily in the way that we, you know, that's a whole other philosophical, like whatever. But then like, but also like then like the, you know, sort of projections onto her become, I guess it's just like, yeah, how anyone is like traversing the, like the internet, how there's like that synthesis or like slippage between the projection versus like the reality of like their lived experience. But in the end, it doesn't matter. Like, I mean, there's also like, I've mentioned this to you before, and it probably isn't that interesting to talk about, but like the, you know, occasionally I'll see the like, the not conspiracy, but the sort of like, you know, weird fake news thing that like, oh, like Lil Michaela is like made by a white guy, and like she's just like, you know, woman of color, and like, why would this man make this one, and like this whole thing.
Yeah.
Like, and all like the sort of like, you know, that side of the conversation. But then it's like, well, like, yeah, but it's all projection of like what someone expects the narrative to be, even like because of like coming out of like a, you know, sorry, whatever. Anyway, so that's like,
no, I think that's super interesting to me. Like, I often think about when I was first on the internet, like I kind of am mentally like zoomered out. Like I live mostly on like Discord and like weird like cultural corners where it's like me and 15-year-olds talking about like Minecraft mods or whatever. But I also was a product of like this kind of like, I remember asking my grandma for like a 56K modem when I was like in middle school. And so in that era, I remember like this kind of trope of being like, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog, that kind of like that cartoon. And I think generationally, like this new era, it like on the internet, like no one knows that like the people on the side of the screen, like they aren't a dog, and then you can project that onto them. Like I'm still kind of working this thought, and like, but like the ability to kind of project meaning onto the person behind the screen because they can't necessarily defend who they are, because there is that kind of that lossy thing where you don't know who's behind it, allows people to kind of create these narratives and kind of like huddle around them and define communities amongst things that are often untrue. You know, insert like QAnon or whatever else. Yeah, no, it's super. I mean, I think like it's like, yeah, like kind of trying to track that arc of like the development or devolution of that you know, classic, you know, the internet, on the internet no one knows your dog thing. Like it's interesting because there was this sort of like linear progression almost, you know, from that moment to like then like, yeah, super corporatized internet where it's like, oh, like now like not only does everyone know, yeah, exactly who you are, but also like every last move you're making is like tracked, whatever. But then, yeah, it's like kind of like the sort of, I want to say it's like almost like these two things have grown over each other in this weird way. Like it's like I'm thinking about it like with like Plato's cave, which is like really silly to think about there, but sort of like, okay, like there's the fire and the flame and then like the shadows on the wall and like, and kind of like you know, but what's really happening is that we're just in this cave and like everything's kind of like and like and there's no, and then it's kind of like, and this is also sort of an ethos that maybe like, you know, but like I think then the answer is like, oh, it's anybody's game. And then it's kind of like, it is all about narrative. And it's like, okay, well, like you can't really prove it either way. And everyone's going to be so obsessed with proving what's actually going on that you can kind of just like say whatever. And then like, you know, kind of, yeah, you can create, you know, a fake persona that then can have like major, like, you know, brand campaigns. And like, you also can, you know, I don't know, it's. No, I think that's totally interesting. I like, this is kind of maybe a bad metaphor riffing on that other thing, but like, there's something probably really disorienting that we all experience, and that like, yeah, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog, but also on the internet, they all can convince the rest of the internet that you're a cat. And while in parallel, like all the like underbelly of the internet, like Facebook and everyone, they all know you're a dog and they're hammering you with like dog ads. And so you're like, wait, where the fuck do I actually exist?
Please tell them I'm a dog. Just tell them.
Yeah, like you know it. And then I think in that opportunity, and I think that kind of like hellscape is a lot of the things that like we try to navigate as an organization. And we do talk a lot about, trying to build more equitable features for artists or creatives, because I do think like that back and forth, that chaos is disconcerting. Like it's going to be interesting to reflect back on this moment in time and look at the kind of like sheer amount of output of kind of like new ideas or creativity, because it does feel like anytime you put something into the ether, there's an opportunity to be canceled or challenged or have like your life ruined. And so, if we can kind of create heat shields and like virtual characters, allow people to kind of like create from behind this thing, is that kind of a veil that allows for kind of like a blossoming of new things versus like having to live in this narrow defined expectation of what you can be.
Which is really interesting. I think maybe it's like a way of like, it's sort of segueing into some of this like, like community and collective, whatever, like that stuff. In that, I mean, it's also a mode of working that has such like a long history in a way, right? Like I've been thinking a lot about, like, I don't know, in quarantine, I've got really into Georges Bataille and like, and like that French intellectual scene or whatever. And just the history of like having like a squad, I guess, and like, and be it an artist collective or be it, just a group of people who then get historicized as spending time together. But the sort of method of, actually like creating a discourse amongst an enclosed group of people in a sort of, enclosed sphere to the degree that you can actually speak freely and not be like, you're not placing a bet. You're not like, I feel like on the larger internet, every opinion feels like you're like placing a bet and you're like, ooh, like, is it gonna, versus being able to actually, have space to, really like create new ideas, like move things forward creatively. And it's interesting because I know like you've been working on some projects that maybe you can talk about your interest in that, which is maybe sort of separate from, or does it feed into the bread stuff, or is it more separate, and how do you?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, I mean, like I even think about, our interactions or like how I got to know you or meet you. And like, I when I was first trying to find my way in the world as an adult, like looking for certain, like aesthetic cues that people was like, oh, like you're this dude in like American Eagle girl jeans, like you're probably into Screamo. We can talk about that or whatever.
Yeah.
And like, then like it became so easy for people to kind of co-opt those aesthetics. They kind of weren't great signals of where people fit in the greater cultural landscape. But there seems to be like new signals emerging, like even flipsterrunoff.com or something, like, like your little pseudonym on Twitter. Like I see that and I'm like, oh, okay. Like there are layers to this cake that like most people wouldn't be able to participate in. So like allows us to kind of form that squad or whatever. But backing into the question, like, so much of my life, I mean, like I hypothetically would have graduated from college in 2008 if I didn't drop out, and like a lot of my peers did. And so it was kind of this, I started DJing professionally kind of in 2006, 2007. I remember playing like gifting suites for like celebrities in Hollywood, and they're getting like, free laptops or free like all this crazy stuff. And then like 2009 playing the same things and giving like a free branded USB with like content on it from the same companies. And so being born in that recession and having to navigate the kind of professional world without a real understanding of what things used to look like for artists meant that a lot of my peers have been just like swimming as fast as we can for as long as we could. And we're now like pretty burnt and exhausted and trying to make sense of like what our economic reality is and what it means for like starting a family or all of these kind of like macro BuzzFeed trend pieces or whatever you read. And as a result, for the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, there's been conversations about like how we could reshape this thing. And I've been interested in it, obviously from like Spotify days and beyond that. But now it seems like there's this emergent set of solutions that people are calling like the passion economy, where it's like the Substacks, the Patreons, the OnlyFans that, kind of bring back the glory days of like transactional media, where it was like, holy heck, like I sold a CD at a show and made $10 versus like I did, 10 streams of that album and made, 5 cents. Like, so all that is to say, yeah.
Is it like, but so the thing with that, right, is like, or I wonder like, is it scalable in a way, I guess, or is it kind of like, are you thinking like, how can you make that? I guess it is scalable because you make so much money on Patreon or like OnlyFans, but then it's also like, you know, it also like locks you into that in a way, but then also it's like you have to be putting out the kind, you know, it becomes like it's like a buyer's market in a weird way too,
Totally,
right?
yeah. I mean, I think there's some I don't think it's Andy Grove, but some like real startup like business head. It's like the only way to make money is through bundling and unbundling. And we just have these cycles, you know, like there are all those memes floating around where it was like, wouldn't it be awesome if someone took Netflix and Hulu and ESPN Plus and and just put them into one thing where I could pay a lower premium? And you're like, oh yeah, that was cable. And we just unbundled it. And so I think you're going to have similar situation in this passion economy situation where it's really exciting. And there's like immediate kind of like sense of like acceleration, these returns that are meaningful. But then if you're late to the game, there are kind of these diminishing returns where you're creating all of this content and trying to compete. But I can only subscribe to 5 Substacks before I'm like maxed out with my budget. So I'm shifting through and trying to optimize. And there's kind of this long tail that's suffering. And so, you know, the dream, I think, or what a lot of my peers are exploring, like what you're exploring, I think when we talk about this stuff is like, are there more collectivist solutions or approaches that allow people to not have to swim as fast as they can all the time? Like, is the reason organizations exist so that people can like ramp on and ramp off and they all kind of live under this umbrella where this content can live, and you're kind of buying into the brand versus this person that's just saying on a treadmill or whatever it is. So yeah, lots of thoughts about that.
Cool. No, yeah, I mean, I think it's like, well, yeah, because like I was starting to say, I think like I don't know, I think I've been trying to, it's interesting because my, you know, like, I think I've always been, in the background, I've always been sorry, it's like weird construction noise, but in the background, I've always been interested in this stuff. And I think part of it for me came out of like, I think like going to Oberlin where there was like a really like intense like cooperative system, but also like my parents grew up in like a like this like big like socialist like co-op experiment in Queens kind of. It was like not super like edgy or whatever, but it was like but it had the same co-op principles as Oberlin, and so it was a kind of this weird through line. And then everyone just kind of did things in this sort of like collectivist way. And then like after graduating, I was like, oh, like this makes sense to me as the way to work and the way to like work, you know, make things with your peers. But then like, of course, going into the art world and stuff, it was just like so not that. And I think I'm always like, okay, how do I get back to that vibe? But then also, I guess like since, you know, we've been talking more about this stuff with, you know, some of the projects that, you know, yeah, sort of like intersecting like network of like things that are going on. I've been trying to like think about it from a like larger scale historical perspective as well. And like, I guess like basically today I just was getting really deep into like anarchist like communalization or communization sort of like stuff. And I was like, oh yeah, this is like what this is. Like, yeah. It's like kind of, and then also just thinking about the larger, like for me, what's interesting too is like the philosophical implications around not only like the sort of practical abolition of a sort of capital relationship that we've, you know, taken for granted, but what that means also for like our understanding of ourselves as subjects. And like there's some intersection between like, this like you know, sort of communal or like collectivized like creative production stuff, and then like the Lil Michaela persona politics stuff that like I haven't yet figured out in my brain, but like I think there's like something interesting there. Like interactivity, I think for a lot of people that means something else or something where it's kind of like, oh, I touched it and it like, like, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I even think about like interactivity. My first experience with that word is like going to South by Southwest as a musician and then building kind of like the tech part, but not wanting to call it like the get tech money part. It was like South by Southwest interactive. Right. And I was like, and I guess that is broad enough that it was like gaming, it was kind of like, you know, consumer tech, enterprise tech, or whatever it was. But there, you know, my experience through all of this stuff is kind of like been, you know, kind of boomer millennial style, having this repulsion towards words, you know, like influencer or interactive or whatever. And then like having to recognize that like, oh man, or even like the word creator, you know, like feels gross, but like more and more I'm like learning to own them and like embrace them in ways that I think young people are, where it's like influencer is an aspirational title, not entirely different than me wanting to be like a rock star or something. Yeah. I'm not that old. I don't want to be a rock star.
Like, no. Okay, well then back to these questions, because we've stayed on track a bit. But okay, so what's next for Brett?
You know, one thing kind of back to narrative stuff, I've always thought a lot about the way traditional narrative and kind of like large narrative industrial complex is imposed upon us. And it's like you start with this long form narrative, traditionally like Star Wars, and then you turn that into like a video game, and then you turn it into a comic book, and then all the way it kind of gets atomized down to a lightsaber you can buy at Target. And I've always wanted to invert that model and kind of work in a more iterative, kind of more like software way, where you start with this like small piece of that long form, and then work up the stack. And so, think about our kind of play. It was like panel by panel storytelling on Instagram, like comic book style stuff, and then we slowly began to introduce video, and then kind of like really short form, almost like story content, and then music videos, and then vlogs, and eventually, we're gonna have like television and film, and hopefully be able to kind of create television and film experiences that are more layered and provide more depth for fans than like the traditional experience. I always find it quite bizarre that like, I don't know, if you're a Gossip Girl super fan, there's kind of like this thick body of content that you can like mine for stuff and have a discourse around. But I think what's cool about the Kardashians, or like the Kardashian Jenner Wests, is that you have the kind of like keeping up with the Kardashian narratives, but then there are all these like sub narratives and like fragments, and you're like, what? Scott's dating Sophia Richie, and like, wait, her sister's Nicole Richie, and she's dating a Madden, and wait, he's into Charlotte, and like you're just like,
Yeah, it's like
it's
well,
infinite.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I've been thinking a lot about that sort of that like narrative and like film and media in relationship to the question of sort of like, I guess like the multiverse, or sort of like the, kind of that. Like I was thinking, because I feel like everyone wants to make movies now. It seems like it's like everybody's like, I want to make a movie. Like every artist is like, I want, every kid, whatever. Maybe that's also just like America, and that's kind of like,
Sure.
Whatever. Like that's Hollywood is taking or whatever. But I think there's also this thing where it's almost like with the media ecosystem that we exist in, it's quite clear that like if you can make a movie or make like some sort of media narrative that then has the capacity to be scaled up to that you can like create your own world basically. And then if you do it in the sort of style of the Kardashians, or like, I don't know another example, but like that you basically, what you're doing is like the way that we relate to images now, you're not just like, oh, I'm making this thing. You are creating like this whole like world that can be like, if you do it in one way, it'll just be
Yeah.
two-dimensional, but if you do it another way, it's like this whole thing out. And there's this like piece by this God, I don't know, it's a book, but it's like an epic poem also by this Renaissance thinker named Giordano Bruno, who was like burned at the stake during the like Copernican revolution, because he basically was like, no, like Copernicus' discovery doesn't mean that like, Earth is like this, sun's following, whatever, like, it's like, it means that there's a possibility for there to be infinite worlds in our universe. And like, it's this whole like crazy argument, basically it's just like there are no fixed points, like anything can be the center. And the way that he's talking about it is completely resonant with our time, but also it's interesting, like a lot of like 1970s experimental filmmakers like were really into him and wrote about how film was like a possible enactment of this, and that film doesn't represent our world, but it really just creates new individual worlds, which I think is just like a really interesting, on a philosophical level, that there's this shift, like this, philosophy gets ahead of it, but then the world gets ahead of that, and we're kind of like entering some new moment. The thing that can signal it to us is like the desires people have, or it's like, oh, like you see people wanting certain things, and it's like that must mean something has shifted.
Well, it's funny because like where you were going, I kind of was like, I thought the stream would go like a complete opposite path. Like, I do think a lot of my peers want to create film. Like kind of like my immediate kind of like similar age, similar kind of like, I don't know, cultural circles. Like I want to make a film. But then like my other kind of like chaotic, nerdy tech world in Discord land, like they want to create games, And I always think like, I forget, this is where I'm just bad. The guy who directed The Godfather, do you remember that? I don't know.
Oh, Coppola? All right.
Yeah, Coppola, probably. Yes, Coppola. I think he was like, and when that film became popularized, he was like, man, like since like the proliferation of cinema, we all have begun to view our lives as cinema, and like we're the main character in it. Yeah. And like, I oftentimes think that we've shifted from that mentality to like, we're all like this character in a giant MMORPG where we're like collecting likes and follows and kind of like transacting those for like side quests. Yeah.
And the other day I got COVID antibody test, and I was like, and it came back positive, and I was like, oh cool, I have antibodies. I was like, more noises. And like, I was like, but I only had like 4. My antibody index was like 4 point something, and my friend had like 52 antibodies, and I was like, did I use up my I imagine them being like lives in a video game where I'm like, oh, like I like hung out with too many people, like my antibodies are gone. Anyway, it's completely unrelated.
No, but I think it's something really interesting there to explore, and that like, and at first I thought you were going to say like all of these people that want to make films like kind of want to be able to control their reality in a world that feels kind of like chaotic. But then actually, maybe it's the other way around, where it's like, you know, like a bunch of like neurodivergent people are like more interested in kind of creating this open world where it is boundless, but it's actually fixed. Like there are a set of constraints. Mm-hmm. And then these other folks are kind of like, oh, we can have our own controlled realities, but gajillions of them that kind of know no bounds.
Right. Well, yeah, that's interesting in terms of the different personalities. I mean, like obviously, as you know, like I'm like want to make and want to make film, whatever. Like that's my thing that I anyway. And so like I feel like it's like I know I'm a control freak in a specific way that might, but also like I know that I'm a like it's interesting thinking. I guess I'm thinking about it as like people who excel in like, and this is not like one or the other. It's not like obviously two, but it's like is there a difference between people who would like choose like sort of like software and like engineering sort of perspective, be able to think through building a world in that way versus someone who like really can only think, like I can't think anything but narratively in a lot of ways. And even the work that I make that's like anti-narrative, it's like, you know, kind of like trying to undo that, but then like kind of, yeah, I don't know, it's interesting, like the sort of, it's different kinds of architectures. But the interesting thing too is like I do know I think like there's an interesting intersection between the two, right? Sort of like in-game like film, or you know, kind of like that sort of thing. And I don't know, but
no, I think it's worth exploring. I mean, I think we all have a couple questions left or whatever, but I think it's worth. I mean, like, I'm thinking about like further implications on like what we have ahead. Like, it's clear we want to do like more narrative stuff with the Michaela stuff, and like film and television are really interesting. But I think beyond that, like expanding the universe of characters is absolutely the dream. You know, I think there's a world where we can kind of have characters that speak to all these different little cultural corners of the universe, no matter where you are in the world, and try to create like shared experiences that can bring people together. I definitely hope that's like a next step in, you know, this internet thing, is that we have some shared experience.
Are there right now?
Really, there's like, I would say like 5, but there's kind of like 3 robots, and then like Kane Intelligence and Brud, our company. And so we live in it in this kind of like WWE way as well.
Interesting.
Yeah. What should we wrap with? Was there anything exciting?
We didn't get to any of the sort of beauty and representation.
Oh yeah. That one's a really funny one. I think like we actually have a lot of conversations about this. It's like, you know, and it's like, that's another funny like timeline where it was like it was like, you know, she's so ugly, I hate her eyebrows with Michaela. And I was like, fuck, that sucks. Like, you know, like I think for a moment was able to embody like, you know, in some ways like the femme experience of being a public figure, where it was like, wow, like as a DJ, I never encountered that ever. You know, no one's ever like, your eyebrows suck. But then it kind of moved on to like, wow, I love, you know, that like her body type is atypical, or that like, you know, she looks ethnically ambiguous enough that I can see myself in it. And then it kind of moved along to like, wait a minute, are you stealing jobs from Black people? And I was like, wait, there's like lots of Black people anyways. And I, you know, they like, but like, I often appreciate the conversation. And I think, you know, the beauty representation piece is interesting to me because it seems like the most of the people that have a problem with that are like older, you know, like they're like boomers, or like woke scolds. And like the kids are like very in on the joke and are very aware of Michaela not being real, and kind of like leverage that to kind of like bait journalistic, like Brooklyn blogger types, and kind of like fuck with them. And so I find it really intriguing to watch dynamics at hand. Like quickly, these people that think they're like young, savvy, hip folks are being like, you know, outmaneuvered by the Zoomers who are using their sensibilities to kind of like poke at them and have fun with them.
Well, it's also interesting because like I think it's like, I mean, it's an interesting question of like labor involved in it, where it's also, I was thinking about this with regard to like some other stuff about like representation and like modeling the other day, where like, you know, people are like, we need more like XYZ like models, which is like, yeah, true, like these, you know, industries should be opened up to people who have like, you know, variety of body types, like, you know, identity, like whatever. But at the same time, it's also because like the specific like framework of modeling is also like, we need more people of this type, like a different type of body to be able to be the product. Like, you know what I mean? Like the most like crystallized way, which is, and it's true of any like, you know, labor dynamic, but it's like a really particular representation of this like larger thing, and how everyone's kind of like buying to. So there's this funny thing, people are like, how dare little Michaela take that, you know, modeling job that I certainly would have gotten were it not for her. It's kind of this funny thing too, where it's like, well, isn't there something interesting about, I mean, I guess it goes back to it's even like an automation argument about like labor, where it's like, well, if you like give that job to like an artificial intelligence, then like people don't have to be packaged alongside products in the same way. But also like they do, but also she's kind of a person, and it just becomes like a mess. And it's really interesting to watch people like not have the tools really, and the tools are out there, I think, but it's funny to really see how the discourse isn't pulling from like, you know, a lot of like all the like post-humanist or like just like internet, you know, like media theory from like the 90s onward that like, you know, very much has figured out a number of ways through this territory. People are just like, I don't really know, like it's like so confusing, and get upset. But
yeah, no, I think there's something, I actually hadn't really thought about that too much, but you're absolutely right. This idea of like, you know, my friends who are models like 2000 were like, I'm a coat hanger, you know, that they would kind of like joke at how disembodied or kind of like how literally like commodity or product like their jobs were.
yeah,
And this like idea of like weaponizing like academic language, or like, you know, the language of like empowerment to become like a product or like a commodity is like,
which again, it goes back to the and as a closing thing or something, but like it goes back to that issue just of like, if in this world you are always already a commodity, like is your best shot to like resist that and try to find ways around it, or to make choices where you give yourself over to certain elements of that, and like, you know, one could say like, you know, accelerate through it, or, you know, just make your peace, survive. Like, I don't know, there's like all these different ways to try to make it there.
Yeah, so with that, no conclusions, but hey, warm nihilism, let's get it, baby.
Amazing. Thank you both. Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Aria. That was an incredible conversation. I think I was taking some notes on the side, and I was like, whoa, we are going like around the world 10 times. Super cool.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. No, thank you both so much. This was really fascinating. I like warm nihilism, the multiverse, nonlinear storytelling, you know, flipping the creation process. I guess just to quickly close, I want to ask you both a question. So we've talked about a lot of different things, and I want to do one sort of call to action. You're both really well regarded and deeply passionate in your respective fields. The folks in our audience are going to be a broad spectrum of folks from like the university community as well as the innovation community at large. If you could sort of have one call to action, what would that be? I know that was, I mean, it's like a serious,
but like, it's going to sound like a joke, but it's like, it's earnest.
Yeah.
You can build like, I don't know, like with your friends and like do like, I don't know, all that seems like that was what came to mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, literally mine feels like that disingenuous as well, but like totally earnest, like be polite, have manners, like be kind to people. Like I feel like the simple stuff is the important stuff. Be nice to service workers.
Yeah.
So true. Let that karma like flow back around. Awesome. And okay, one last thing. We've talked a lot about different sort of references and sort of like big ideas, philosophers, companies, you know, platforms. If you could make a nod or ask people to check out one thing, what would that be? What's like the cool thing that like, what's the interesting thing that you're really excited about that you think people should know about?
Oh, this is where I should plug. I have a cool little community called Friends with Benefits. It's www.fwb.help for information. And a lot of my favorite thinkers are in there and having conversations that are kind of all approached in good faith. And I think you should check it out and come join us.
And I guess the thing I should plug is that I have a magazine that I started with some friends and colleagues called November Magazine. That a lot of these ideas are, it's like, right now it's an interview platform basically. I did an interview with Frank Wilderson, who's like my favorite like theorist of all time, probably, or favorite living theorist. But it's going to turn over into becoming like a more fleshed out, full-on magazine project, and a lot of these ideas will be worked through for sure in that. So check that out.
Awesome.
I guess
Thank
it's
you.
like a self-serving plug. I'm trying to think of something that I don't have anything to do with.
I'm trying to think of like a good or like a point of entry. Like if not that, I don't know, like Adam Curtis or something. Those are easy and like kind of fun.
Read all of Mark Fisher's K-punk blog. Front to
Feedbacks.
back. Like, I don't know. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. With that, thank you both so much. Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Aria. Thank you.